Miriam Hale learned to move carefully long before she learned she was pregnant. At 55, caution had become muscle memory. How she rose from bed, how she breathed through the ache in her lower back, how she held her face still when people asked harmless questions. The secret inside her body demanded that kind of precision. One wrong movement, one careless word, and everything she had kept buried would surface. Each morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than necessary, studying the woman she had become. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had thinned and silvered. Fine lines traced her mouth, etched by years of restraint rather than laughter. Beneath her oversized sweater, her stomach curved forward in a way that felt impossible, almost obscene. Miriam pressed her palm against it, not lovingly, but as if checking whether it was real. She had told no one. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that rang in her ears. The clock ticked loudly from the hallway. Measuring time she felt she had already used up. Miriam swallowed a wave of nausea and reached for her coat. A doctor's appointment waited. Another one scheduled under a different clinic. Another explanation she would not give. Outside, the cold air bit her face, sharp and punishing. It felt deserved. Miriam welcomed the discomfort as she locked the door behind her, as if pain could balance the weight of what she carried. The town watched without watching. Neighbors nodded. Cars passed. No one looked long enough to truly see her. That anonymity was her shield. At the clinic, she avoided eye contact. The nurse spoke gently, too gently, and Miriam answered in clipped phrases. When a heartbeat filled the room, fast, undeniable, she turned her head toward the wall. Tears threatened, but she forced them back. She did not trust herself with softness. On the drive home, memories surfaced uninvited. A voice from the past, a hand lingering too long, words spoken in secrecy, coded in reassurance and control. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenched. Regret, she had learned, did not fade with time. It learned how to wait. Back in the house, Miriam folded laundry she didn't need to wash, cooked food she barely touched. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards. She sat heavily on the edge of the couch, breathing through a sudden tightness in her chest. This was not how her life was supposed to look at this age. This was not how motherhood was meant to return. A photograph on the shelf caught her eye. A younger version of herself stood beside a teenage boy, his arms slung awkwardly around her shoulder. Evan, her son. His smile in the picture was guarded even then, as if he learned early not to expect too much from a world. Miriam reached for the frame, her fingers trembling. Evan was grown now, too observant, too quiet. She had noticed the way his eyes lingered on her lately, the way questions formed behind them and went unasked. He sensed something. She knew that in her bones. "I'm protecting you," she whispered to the empty room, though she wasn't sure which of them she meant. As night settled in, headlights swept briefly across the living room walls. A car pulling into the driveway. Miriam stiffened, her heart quickening. Footsteps approached the door, familiar, measured, careful. She rose slowly, smoothing her sweater down over her stomach just as the lock turned. Evan was home. Evan entered the house without announcing himself, the way he always did. He had learned long ago that silence kept him safer, from arguments, from expectations, from questions he didn't know how to answer. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for a moment he stood still, listening. The house sounded different lately, tighter, like it was holding its breath. "Hey," Miriam said from the living room, too quickly. Evan stepped into view. His mother stood near the couch, hands folded in front of her, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. Her sweater hung loose, but not loose enough. Evan's eyes moved there, before he could stop himself. "You're home early," she added. "Work was slow," he replied. His voice came out flat, practiced. He shrugged off his jacket and set his keys on the table, placing them precisely in the same spot he always used. Order calmed him. Disorder made his thoughts spiral. Miriam watched him with an intensity she tried to hide. Evan felt it anyway. He always did. He went to the kitchen, opening the fridge, though he wasn't hungry. His gaze kept drifting back to a reflection in the dark window. She moved carefully, like someone recovering from an injury she refused to name. "You okay?" he asked, casual on the surface. "I'm fine," she said, too fast again. Evan closed the fridge. Fine had become her favorite word. Fine meant don't ask. Fine meant there was something she didn't want him to see. That night, he lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly, settling around him. His thoughts replayed the small details he couldn't ignore anymore. The way she started wearing oversized clothes, the way she avoided lifting anything heavy, the late nights when she thought he was asleep and whispered into her phone. She never used to hide things from him. At least, that's what he believed. Growing up, it had always been the two of them. No father hovering in the background. No explanations offered, either. Evan learned early to fill in gaps on his own. He learned to read moods, anticipate needs, adjust himself accordingly. His mother called it maturity. Teachers called it quiet. Inside, it felt like vigilance. The next morning, he noticed a pill bottle on the bathroom counter. Prenatal vitamins. The words hit him like a sudden drop in temperature. He stood there longer than necessary, staring, his mind scrambling for an explanation that made sense. Miriam was in the kitchen when he came out. She froze when she saw his face. "Those aren't mine," she said before he spoke. The lie landed between them, heavy and clumsy. Evan nodded slowly. "Okay." But something cracked open inside him. A dull pressure built behind his eyes. Not anger yet. Something colder. He began paying closer attention. He noted dates on the calendar circled in red. Excuses that didn't line up, a doctor's office number saved under a fake name on her phone when she asked him to fix it. At work, he found himself distracted, replaying moments from the past. His childhood, her protectiveness, the way she'd always framed sacrifice as love. "I gave everything up for you," she used to say. Evan had believed that meant loyalty was owed in return. One evening, he followed her. He told himself it was concern, that if something was wrong, he had a right to know. He watched from his car as she entered a clinic on the other side of town. When she came back out, her face was pale, her movements slow and deliberate. On the drive home, his hands trembled on the steering wheel. That night, as Miriam slept, Evan sat alone in the living room, staring at the family photo on the shelf, the same one she had held the night before. He didn't remember smiling when it was taken. He remembered standing there, stiff, sensing even then that there were things he wasn't being told. Whatever his mother was hiding, Evan knew one thing with absolute certainty now. It involved him, and he wasn't going to stop watching until the truth came out. By the time Evan noticed the town watching his mother, it had already been watching for weeks. It began subtly. A pause too long at the grocery checkout. A neighbor's smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miriam felt it first. The shift in air when she entered a room. The way conversations dulled and then resumed once she passed. Small towns didn't need evidence. They survived on suggestion. Evan became aware of it one afternoon when he stopped by the pharmacy to pick up painkillers for her back. As he waited at the counter, he saw the pharmacist glance at him, then toward the aisle Miriam usually walked down. "How's your mom doing?" the woman asked, pretending to straighten receipts. "She's fine," Evan replied, the word automatic. The pharmacist nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." Evan left with a knot forming in his stomach. Outside, he sat in his car longer than necessary, replaying the tone of her voice. It wasn't concern. It was curiosity dressed up as politeness. At home, Miriam was folding clothes on the couch. Evan noticed she'd started keeping the blinds half closed, even during the day. The light cut through the room in thin, cautious strips. "You didn't need to go out," she said when he handed her the bag. "I could have done it myself." "You shouldn't," he replied before thinking. The word shouldn't hung between them, heavier than intended. Miriam stiffened but said nothing. Later that week, Lydia approached her in the break room at the manufacturing office where Miriam worked part-time. Lydia was the kind of woman who blended into walls. Soft-spoken, observant, often underestimated. She handed Miriam a cup of tea without asking. "You look tired," Lydia said gently. Miriam forced a smile. "I haven't been sleeping." Lydia hesitated, then lowered her voice. People talk. Miriam's hand tightened around the cup. About what? Lydia didn't answer directly. She never did. Small towns get bored. They fill the silence with stories. That night, Miriam cried in the shower, water masking the sound. She told herself it didn't matter, that she could endure whispers the way she'd endured everything else. But shame has a way of sinking into the skin, and she felt it there, clinging, refusing to wash away. Evan noticed a change in her posture. She moved through the house like she was shrinking, shoulders curved inward, eyes always scanning windows and doorways. His protectiveness sharpened into something else, resentment. Whoever was watching her had no right. One afternoon, as he pulled into their driveway, he caught sight of Mrs. Caldwell from across the street pretending to adjust her mailbox. Her gaze flicked toward the house, then away. Evan stared back until she noticed and flushed. Inside, he confronted his mother without meaning to. "People are talking," he said. Miriam froze. "Who? Does it matter?" She turned away, focusing on the stove. Let them talk. But Evan couldn't. Each whisper felt like an accusation against him as well, against their life, their boundaries. He began noticing more, how the cashier lingered when Miriam paid, how someone at church asked if she was feeling well with a knowing tilt of the head. The town didn't know the truth, but it sensed something wrong. That was worse. One evening, Evan overheard two women outside the diner, laughing softly as Miriam walked past. "Isn't she a little old for—" one began. Evan didn't hear the rest. He didn't need to. That night, he searched online, forums, records, anything that could explain how something like this could happen. He told himself he was preparing, protecting her. But the more he read, the more his thoughts darkened, turning inward. Secrets didn't stay buried here. They surfaced, and when they did, they demanded names. As Miriam locked the door and drew the curtains, she felt the walls closing in. Evan stood in the hallway, watching her, watching the house, watching the town beyond it. Both of them understood the same unspoken truth now. Whatever she was hiding, the town was getting close. And soon, Evan would stop waiting for answers and start asking the questions she feared most. Evan waited until the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it could swallow a person whole. Miriam was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup she barely needed, humming a tune that sounded hollow even in her own ears. Evan leaned against the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets. The tension in his shoulders coiled like a spring ready to snap. "You're late," Miriam said without looking up. Her voice was calm, but Evan noticed a tremor at the edges. "I had things to do," he said, stepping closer. His eyes traced the curve of her stomach again, a physical truth she could no longer hide. He had watched her long enough to see patterns, schedules, even the smallest lies. The pills in the bathroom, the doctor's visits, the whispers in the town. And now, finally, he wanted the truth. "You don't have to do this," Miriam said softly, sensing where this conversation was heading. "I need to know," he said. "I need to know who he is." The words landed like stones in the empty room. She froze, spoon midair, and slowly set it down. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Evan thought he saw something break in her, a flicker of fear, of sorrow, of exhaustion. But then she closed it off, pressed her lips together, and shook her head. "I can't," she whispered. Evan felt a cold wave creep up his spine. He stepped closer. "Why not?" "I promised myself I wouldn't say," she said. "I made a choice to keep this to myself. It's not for you, Evan." His pulse quickened. "Not for me? Mom, I have a right to know. I live here. I need to know whose." He broke off, unable to articulate the anger, betrayal, and fear that roared in his chest. Miriam turned away, pressing her hand against the counter. Her voice quavered slightly. "You think I would hide something from you to hurt you? I'm trying to protect you. You can't understand this is complicated." Evan's jaw tightened. "Complicated? This isn't about complicated, Mom. You're carrying someone else's child. You didn't even tell me, and I had to figure it out. I had to follow you, watch you, piece together the truth from crumbs." The silence that followed was suffocating. Miriam's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. Evan felt a rush of satisfaction that finally forced her to face him, but it was short-lived, replaced by confusion and a gnawing emptiness. "You think I wanted this?" she said finally, her voice raw. "Do you think it's easy to live like this, knowing how people see me, knowing what I've done, what I've chosen? I'm scared every day. And now I have to face you." Evan stared at her, searching for cracks, for anything that might reveal the man behind the mystery, but found only exhaustion. Her fear mirrored his own, and for the first time, he realized how fragile she had become. "Then tell me one thing," he said, softer now. "Why? Why didn't you ever tell me anything?" Miriam's eyes flickered toward the floor. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "Because some truths change everything," she whispered. Evan's mind raced. He wanted to push further, to demand answers, to force the story out of her. But instead, he clenched his fists, feeling helpless, frustrated, and more obsessed than ever. The secret hung between them like a storm cloud waiting to break, and Evan realized that the question he had asked, the one she refused to answer, was only the beginning. He left the kitchen that night, pacing the hallway, replaying the conversation in his head. Every refusal, every hesitation, every carefully chosen word replayed like a film. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would get the answers. Somehow, because some question, once asked, refused to be ignored. Miriam hadn't meant for his name to surface. Not tonight. Not when the house was quiet and Evan sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed on hers like a hawk waiting for a flaw. She had hoped the shadows of her past would remain buried, but the walls in this town had ears, and her son had eyes that saw too much. It began with a question she had anticipated for weeks. Evan's voice was calm, almost deceptively gentle. "Who is he?" Miriam froze mid-breath. The teacup in her hands rattled against the saucer. She had rehearsed every word, every deflection, every lie she could muster. Yet now, confronted with Evan's steady gaze, her rehearsed responses dissolved into silence. "Who is the father?" he clarified, leaning forward. She swallowed hard. Memories she had tried to lock away surfaced unbidden. A man's laugh that made her heart both soar and break. Hands that lingered too long. Whispers in hotel rooms and empty alleyways. Promises that were never meant to be kept. His name felt like a razor against her tongue. "Evan!" She began softly, but the sound of his name made the words falter. He interrupted gently, almost pleading. "I need to know, Mom. I can't protect you if I don't." Miriam shook her head. Her chest felt tight, her throat raw. "It's complicated." But Evan saw through her hesitation. He had always been able to. Something in the tilt of her chin, the way her eyes darted toward the window, the tight set of her shoulders. He recognized the telltale signs of fear, shame, and something darker, regret. "You've been hiding this for months. For years, maybe. I see it in you." "I see him," Evan said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't fix it if you won't tell me." Miriam pressed a hand to her forehead. "His name, it's Daniel Cross." The words felt like an avalanche, sudden and impossible to stop. Evan stiffened, the spoon in his hand rattling against the table. Daniel Cross, a man the town knew, respected, admired, a man Miriam had loved once, and perhaps still did in some fragmented corner of her memory. A man whose presence in her past had shaped her present in ways Evan could not yet comprehend. Daniel Cross. Evan repeated, as though saying it aloud might anchor him in reality. His mind raced. Memories of whispered phone calls, shadowed meetings, and unspoken promises swirled together. But why him? How could you? Miriam's eyes filled with tears. She had no excuse that would make sense. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I thought it was over. I thought it was buried. But it wasn't. And now. She trailed off, unable to voice the truth, that she carried a child conceived under circumstances tangled with desire, fear, and betrayal. Evan's face darkened, a shadow of disbelief and hurt stretching across features Miriam had memorized since his childhood. You've risked everything. Your reputation, our lives for him. It wasn't like that. Miriam's voice cracked, a mix of anger and desperation. It was complicated. He controlled me, Evan. He manipulated me. I didn't have a choice. Not really. Evan's hands clenched into fists. Control, manipulation, words he'd seen her use quietly before, but now the magnitude hit him fully. The man from the past wasn't just a figure in a photograph. He was real, present in ways Evan hadn't realized. A threat, a puzzle, and worst of all, a key to everything Miriam had hidden from him. The kitchen felt smaller. The walls pressed in. The lights overhead buzzed softly, as if echoing the tension that hung in the air between mother and son. Evan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft hum of the refrigerator. Miriam took a shaky breath. You need to understand, it's not just his fault. I let it happen. I failed to protect myself. And I've been trying to protect you ever since. Evan's gaze hardened. He wanted to yell, to shake her, to demand answers, but the fury in him had not yet found a path. Instead, he felt a cold, creeping certainty settling over him. The revelation of Daniel Cross's identity had changed everything. He nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. So that's it. That's the man. The one who ruined everything. Miriam's fingers trembled against the edge of the table. She looked at Evan, searching his face, hoping for some sign of understanding. But she only saw the first flicker of a storm she feared he could not control, a storm that would not end until the answers he demanded were given. And she knew, deep down, that once the past had been named, it could never be hidden again. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. The secrets of yesterday had finally arrived at the doorstep of today. And tomorrow, Evan would begin piecing them together in ways Miriam could neither anticipate nor stop. The revelation of Daniel Cross's name had settled into Evan's mind like a splinter he could not remove. He went through the following days moving through the house in a tense, calculated rhythm, watching his mother with sharpness that bordered on obsession. Every glance, every cough, every sudden pause in her movements felt like a secret code he needed to decipher. The concern he claimed to feel for her had begun to twist into something darker, a need for control, for answers he wasn't ready to hear in full. Miriam noticed it immediately. She felt the weight of his gaze even when he wasn't looking directly at her. Cups of tea left on the counter, folded laundry left on the couch. Even the placement of her keys seemed to invite scrutiny. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a cage, and she was both prisoner and warden. One morning, she entered the kitchen to find Evan at the table, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What are you doing?" she asked cautiously. "I'm looking for him," Evan replied without looking up. "Daniel Cross. I want to know everything." Miriam felt a tightening in her chest. "Evan, you shouldn't." "It's my right to know," he interrupted, voice rising despite himself. The anger had a quiet precision now, coiled, deliberate. "If he's involved, I need to understand it. I need to see it, hear it, trace it, whatever it takes." Her hands shook. "You can't fix what happened, Evan. It's not something you can control." But Evan already had. He was compiling social media profiles, past business connections, old interviews, even property records. He mapped out the man's life meticulously, charting every location, every habit. What had begun as curiosity turned into surveillance, a compulsive need to know the contours of Daniel Cross's existence, as if by knowing them, he could shield his mother, or perhaps shield himself from a truth he couldn't face. Evan's obsession bled into their conversations. Every casual remark Miriam made was analyzed, every hesitation dissected. He questioned her about phone calls, emails, and even the way she interacted with neighbors. He framed it as protection, but Miriam felt the subtle cage closing around her with each passing day. "You're smothering me," she said one night, voice low, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "You're hiding something." Evan snapped, leaning toward her. His eyes were wild now, unrecognizable in their intensity. You've been hiding it for months. How am I supposed to trust anything you say? Miriam flinched at the sharpness in his tone. She remembered the little boy who had once leaned against her shoulder, asking innocent questions about the stars. That boy had never returned. In his place now was a man she didn't recognize, shaped by suspicion and obsession. Even outside the house, Evan's vigilance did not waver. He followed Miriam to appointments, shadowed her steps at the grocery store, lingered in her presence at work with a quiet, unsettling intensity. She felt eyes on her constantly, whether they were his or the imagined gaze of the town she had once escaped into silence to avoid. In the dead of night, Miriam lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing patterns in the moonlight as it filtered through the curtains. She knew his love was genuine, at least in the fragments of him she remembered. But it had turned into a dangerous weapon now. Care had become control. Concern had mutated into surveillance. The balance had tipped, and there was no turning back. Evan, for his part, believed he was acting out of loyalty, out of a need to protect the mother he adored. He justified every step, every intrusion, every check of her phone, every question about her doctor's visits, every silent hour spent scanning the shadows outside her window. It was all for her. Yet, neither of them realized that in this dangerous dance, the lines between protector and predator were blurring, and with the name of Daniel Cross hanging between them, unspoken threats and half-truths would soon lead to a confrontation neither could escape. By the time Miriam finished her sleepless night, she understood a terrifying truth. Control was no longer about Daniel Cross or even the past. It was about Evan, and she was losing him to the darkness that had grown quietly, steadily, in the spaces between mother and son. Tomorrow, Evan would take the first irreversible steps in the pursuit of the truth. And Miriam, despite her fear, knew she could not stop him. The air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken words. Evan had spent days circling the edges of his mother's life, tracing her steps, analyzing her every glance and gesture, and every thread of deception he could uncover. But until tonight, the one truth he had been desperate to hear, the name of the father, had remained locked behind Miriam's carefully constructed walls. He pushed his chair back and stood, pacing in short, measured steps. "You've been hiding it long enough," he said, his voice taut. "I know there's someone. Tell me who he is." Miriam had been sitting at the table, staring at her teacup as if it contained some secret answer. The shadows of the dim kitchen light stretched across her face, accentuating the fatigue and fear that had etched themselves into her skin. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands. She had delayed this moment for weeks, even months, fearing the collapse that might follow if the truth ever surfaced. And now, with Evan standing before her, the moment had arrived whether she was ready or not. "It's Daniel Cross," she whispered finally, barely audible. The words were fragile, like porcelain cracking under pressure. Evan froze, the syllables hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. His mind stopped and started in rapid, jagged pulses. Daniel Cross, the man she had loved, feared, and been entangled with years ago, was not just a ghost from her past. He was real, alive, respected in the town. A figure whose shadow now fell over everything Evan had known about his family, about his mother, about himself. Daniel Cross. Evan repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. His pulse raced. But why? How could you? The words faltered. He felt the room constrict around him, walls bending under the weight of betrayal, fear, and confusion. Miriam's voice trembled. "It wasn't like that, not exactly. He had a hold on me, Evan. It wasn't just desire, it was control, manipulation. I thought it was over. I thought it would stay buried." Evan's eyes narrowed. "Control?" he echoed, a cold edge slicing through his voice. "Do you mean he forced you?" "No," she cried, startled by the implication. "It wasn't physical. It was emotional, psychological. He knew how to make me compliant. I let him in. I allowed him to have power over me, even though I knew it was wrong. I thought I could stop it, but I couldn't. I thought I could protect myself. And I thought I could protect you." Evan's mind spun. He had seen her strength all his life, had relied on it, depended on it. And yet here was proof that she had been vulnerable, manipulated, and broken in ways he had never imagined. His anger flared, not just at her, but at Daniel Cross, at the unfairness, at the betrayal of trust, at the fragility of everything he thought he understood. "You let him do this?" he said quietly, his voice tight. "You let him ruin everything, and you didn't tell me?" "I tried to," Miriam said, tears welling in her eyes. "I tried to shield you. I wanted to bear it alone. I thought it was the only way to survive this without losing you too." Evan's chest felt heavy, like a weight pressing down from the inside. The love he had always felt for his mother now collided violently with feelings of fear, betrayal, and helplessness. "Do you know what this does to me?" he asked. "Do you know how it changes everything?" "Yes," she whispered. "And I'm sorry. I can't undo it." The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched over the table, between their faces, across the walls of the house, a chasm neither could cross. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, echoing the storm that had broken within the room. Evan sat down again, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He felt a fracture inside himself, a cold void where trust had been. The knowledge of Daniel Cross's identity had shattered the world as he knew it. It wasn't just a name, it was a key, a trigger, a turning point. The carefully constructed life he had understood about his mother, about their family, about himself, had collapsed. Miriam watched him carefully, fear and sorrow mingling in her gaze. She had prepared for this confrontation, but nothing had prepared her for the intensity of his reaction, for the storm of confusion and control that now threatened to consume them both. "Now I know," Evan said finally, his voice low, almost deadly in its calm. "Now I know everything, and I'll make sure nothing stays hidden anymore." Miriam's heart skipped. She understood that tone. It was a voice of a son who loved too deeply, who watched too closely, and who was beginning to blur the lines between protection and obsession. The past had caught up with him, and Daniel Cross's name was the spark that had ignited a fire she could no longer contain. Outside the house, shadows deepened in the night. Inside, Evan sat back in his chair, mind racing, plotting, calculating. Tomorrow, nothing would be the same. And Miriam, trembling, realized with a cold clarity that the truth she had finally spoken might be more dangerous than the secret she had kept. After the revelation, the house felt different. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, absorbing the tension that had once only lived in Evan's mind. Miriam moved through the rooms cautiously, almost invisible, as though her own presence might provoke another eruption. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder. Every whisper of the wind against the windows carried the weight of accusation. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and full of unspoken threats. Evan sat in the living room, staring at the photograph of himself and his mother when he was 14, the day before the world began to feel complicated. His eyes traced the curve of her smile, now a memory, and he remembered the way he had leaned against her, trusting her to guide him. Now that trust felt fragile, cracked. The knowledge of Daniel Cross had planted a seed of distrust that grew a little each day, feeding off shadows and half-seen glances. "Mom," Evan said, breaking the silence as she passed by the kitchen. His tone was soft but rigid, a tightrope between anger and concern. "Where were you today?" Miriam froze mid-step. "Out," she said lightly, attempting casualness that fell flat. "That's not enough," Evan pressed. "I saw the clinic. Why didn't you tell me?" Miriam's hands trembled. "I didn't want to worry you," she said, her voice barely audible. I thought it would be easier if I handled it myself." Evan's jaw tightened. "Easier for you, not for me." The room seemed to shrink. The air thickened with things neither of them could say aloud. Even when Miriam moved away, Evan's gaze followed her, cataloging her every movement. She could feel it, like heat radiating from him, a presence that was too close, too intense. Every action, no matter how mundane, became a statement, a potential lie, a thread in a web he was weaving in his mind. Days passed, marked by this quiet surveillance. Miriam noticed it in small ways. Evan lingering near the doorway when she spoke on the phone, his eyes flicking toward her laptop screen, the way he seemed to know where she had been before she had returned home. She tried to retreat into normalcy, cooking, cleaning, folding laundry, anything to fill the oppressive quiet. But it was impossible. The house itself seemed to hum with tension. Even the furniture held a weight, as if knowing it had witnessed too much. At night, Miriam lay awake, listening. Footsteps in the hallway, soft breathing from Evan's room, the distant hum of a refrigerator. It all felt amplified. The shadows cast by the moon through half-closed blinds seemed alive, crawling along the walls like invisible witnesses. She wondered how it had come to this. A mother and son, bound by love, now trapped in a house filled with silence, so heavy it felt almost physical. Evan, meanwhile, had begun to catalog her daily routines, small habits, anything that could provide him with leverage or insight, where she kept her keys, how she answered the phone, the time she left the house. It all became data points, a map of behavior he could analyze and control. In his mind, this was care, protection, love, yet it had mutated into something insidious. His presence, always hovering, always watching, was suffocating. Miriam caught herself speaking less, moving less, withdrawing into corners of the house where shadows offered comfort. Even the television, normally a distraction, was left on mute, its flickering images failing to penetrate the thick silence. Every interaction had become measured, every word weighed for its potential impact. One evening, Evan followed her to bedroom, silently watching as she changed into night clothes. She sensed him there and froze, hands on her chest. "You don't have to hide from me," he said softly, though the softness did not reach his eyes. "I know," she whispered, though she did not move. The house seemed to shrink even further, closing around them. Silence had become a living entity, watching, judging, pressing down on both of them. And in that suffocating stillness, both realized that their fragile connection, once defined by trust and love, was fraying. Miriam understood, with a cold clarity, that nothing could restore the air to the house. Not apologies, not explanations, not even Evan's love. The balance of power had shifted, and the silence now carried the weight of inevitability. Tomorrow, that silence would break. Something was coming, and neither mother nor son could escape the truth it would bring. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Shadows stretched across the walls, long and accusatory, and the air felt dense, almost physical. Miriam had been pacing for hours, trying to keep her hands busy, trying to convince herself that the tension pressing down on her chest was ordinary, a byproduct of stress, fatigue, the weight of her secret. But she knew better. She felt the presence of her son in every corner, in every creak of the floorboards, in every whisper of the wind to the half-closed blinds. Evan had not spoken much that evening. He had been sitting in the living room, silent, brooding, his eyes flicking from her to the photograph of them on the wall, the one from years ago, when he was still a child who believed the world was simple and safe. Tonight, that world had collapsed. Tonight, he was not her son. Tonight, he was something unrecognizable. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate. "We need to talk." Miriam stopped pacing and turned toward him. Every instinct screamed for her to remain calm, to choose her words carefully, to placate him. But the sight of him tense, rigid, a storm contained only by his measured breathing, made her stomach churn. "I've told you everything I can," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About Daniel, about the pregnancy, about me." Evan rose from the chair, his movements slow, deliberate, almost predatory. "No, you haven't," he said. "You've told me fragments. You've told me pieces I can't trust. I need the rest. All of it. Every detail." Miriam's hand shook as she gripped the edge of the counter. "There is nothing more to tell. I've told you everything that matters." "Everything that matters to you," he snapped, the calm he had maintained earlier cracking into sharp edges. "But what about me? What about our family? What about the truth?" Her chest tightened, a choking sensation that left her speechless. She had spent weeks trying to prepare him, trying to soften the blow, to manage the storm she could feel rising in him. But nothing could have prepared her for the intensity in his eyes, the cold calculation she glimpsed there. Evan moved closer, the floor creaking under his weight. Miriam could see the hand that rested loosely at his side, a hand that could be steady or deadly, and fear rooted her to the spot. "I trusted you," he said, his voice low, trembling with emotion. "I trusted you to protect me, to tell me the truth when it mattered. And you didn't. You hid him. You hid the baby. You lied to me." Miriam opened her mouth, but no words came. She had nothing left. Everything she had held inside, every secret, every regret, every feared judgment, it all crowded the room, filling the space between them. Evan's hand went to the pocket of his jeans. Time seemed to slow. Miriam's eyes widened as she realized what he carried. Her breath caught, her heart pounding like a drum. "Evan," she whispered, but the sound was fragile, lost in the charged silence. The gun was in his hand now, and the weight of it was heavier than she could bear. The air vibrated with the possibility of violence. It was not just a weapon. It was a culmination of his obsession, his fear, his sense of betrayal. "I can't let this lie go on," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own emotions. "I won't." Miriam shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Please, please don't do this." And then it happened. The shot rang out. It echoed twice, once in a room, once in the chamber of Miriam's chest, and then again in the hallways of memory and fear. Miriam fell, the world tilting, colors bleeding into darkness. Evan's eyes widened in shock, the weight of what he'd done crashing down on him immediately. For a moment, there was silence, absolute, suffocating silence. He stared at her, unable to process, unable to believe. The house that held their shared life now held only echoes of a moment that could never be undone. Miriam's blood pooled around her like spilled ink on the kitchen floor. She reached a trembling hand toward him, her eyes wide and full of sorrow and love, but she could no longer speak. Evan dropped the gun, the metallic clatter loud in the room. Panic replaced calculation. Regret replaced obsession. He fell to his knees beside her, shaking, unable to comprehend the finality of his actions. Mom, please," he whispered, voice breaking. But the damage was done. The room was filled with silence again, but this time it was a different silence, one of irrevocable loss, of mistakes that could never be taken back, of love twisted into destruction. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, carrying with it a sense of inevitability, as if the world itself had recognized the weight of the crime. The house that had been suffocating them with quiet now seemed empty, hollowed out, a vessel for grief and guilt. Evan's hands trembled over her still body. For the first time, he truly saw the consequences of obsession, of control, of love that had turned dark. And he realized with a cold, shattering clarity that nothing, not truth, not secrets, not revelations, could undo the moment that had just occurred. The shot had echoed twice, once in the kitchen and once inside him, a reverberation that would never fade. The sound of sirens tore through the night, like an alarm echoing in Evan's skull. He had barely managed to drag himself away from his mother's body before the neighbors called the authorities. Within minutes, the house, once a sanctuary, then a prison of silence, was swarming with flashing lights, uniformed officers, and the murmur of the curious. Evan sat on the front steps, hands trembling, clothes stained, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. He watched as paramedics moved past him with solemn efficiency, carrying the weight of the irreversible truth. Miriam was gone, her life extinguished in a single moment of obsession, and now everything she had hidden, everything she had protected, would be dissected in the cold light of public scrutiny. Detective Harris knelt beside him, not unkindly, but with professional precision. "Son, you need to tell us what happened," he said. His voice was calm, the tone of someone accustomed to devastation, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Evan nodded numbly. Words stumbled out, shaky and disjointed. I didn't mean she. I thought, I needed to know. I needed the truth." "You've told us enough to start," Harris said. "We'll handle the rest." Meanwhile, the town began to stir. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by curiosity, judgment, and inexorable need for closure. The name of Daniel Cross resurfaced publicly, whispered in church pews, at grocery store counters, and behind closed doors. What had once been a secret, The manipulation, the forbidden relationship, the pregnancy, was now open for everyone to dissect. News crews arrived, their cameras focusing on a house with an almost predatory fascination. Headlines would call it tragedy, scandal, horror. The story would be retold 100 times, each iteration shaped by someone else's perspective. Each were a fragment of reality twisted by emotion and speculation. Evan sat in a small holding room at the station, the weight of his actions pressing down like stone. He had known his obsession was dangerous, but he had never imagined the totality of its consequences. His mother's death was immediate, irreparable, and now every lie she had carried, every shadow, every whispered phone call, every act of concealment, was public knowledge. Through it all, Daniel Cross's presence loomed, both absent and impossible to ignore. Journalists were already circling, contacts digging into his past. Evan realized with a sickening clarity that the revelation of Daniel's identity had not protected anyone. It had unleashed the full consequences of the secrets he had tried so hard to uncover. A social worker entered the room to begin documenting the psychological impact, asking Evan questions about his relationship with his mother, the pregnancy, and the weeks leading up to the incident. Each answer he gave, each confession of surveillance, fear, and control, further solidified the picture of family fractured by obsession and secrecy. And then it hit him, the lesson his mother had tried, in her own flawed way, to convey. Silence, secrecy, and manipulation may protect in the moment, but truth has its price. Every hidden detail carries consequences, often unforeseen and devastating. Evan had sought truth as a shield, but it had become a weapon. In the pursuit of control, he had destroyed the very thing he wished to protect. Later, in the sterile light of the station, Evan finally allowed himself to collapse into the chair. Tears fell freely, unguarded, mingling grief, guilt, and recognition. He had acted out of love, twisted into obsession. He had acted out of fear, frustration, and betrayal. But most of all, he had acted without realizing that the pursuit of truth, when uncontrolled, can be fatal. Even as he confessed to the authorities, Evan understood that justice would follow, but that it would never feel like closure. Daniel Cross's reputation would be scrutinized, the town would judge, and history would record his mother's secrets as scandal. Yet no verdict, no sentence, could return what had been lost. Outside, the wind rattled the windows of the Hale house, carrying the memory of a night when silence had broken into chaos. The town whispered, cameras flashed, and life continued, indifferent to the pain left behind. The cost of truth, Evan realized, was far higher than he or anyone could have anticipated. He would live with it forever. The absence of his mother, the weight of his actions, and the understanding that some truths, when revealed too late, can demand the ultimate price. And yet, even amid the devastation, a single thought persisted in his mind, haunting and inescapable. The past, no matter how hidden, always finds a way to reach the present. The courtroom had emptied. The press had moved on to fresher scandals, and the town that had once whispered and watched now returned to its ordinary rhythms. Yet for Evan, life had fractured irreparably. The house that had sheltered his childhood, that had echoed with laughter and arguments and secrets, now felt hollow, a mausoleum of memories, of what had been lost and what could never be reclaimed. He walked through the room slowly, each step stirring the ghosts of the past. The photograph of him and Miriam still hung on the living room wall. He stared at it, tracing the curve of her smile with his eyes. That smile had once represented safety, guidance, and unconditional love. Now it was a relic, a reminder that the very foundation of his life had been built on fragile trust and hidden truths. Evan sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly in his lap, and thought about the chain of events that had led to this point. Daniel Cross's name, the pregnancy, the secrets, they had all been catalysts for tragedy. But Evan recognized that the true destruction had not come from the past alone. It had come from within him, from his own obsession, his desire for control, and the inability to let things unfold naturally. He realized with a painful clarity that truth comes at a cost, and sometimes that cost is unbearable. Miriam had carried her own burden for decades, hiding the past to protect him, and in trying to uncover everything, he had shattered the delicate balance that had kept them alive. Love and protection had become indistinguishable from obsession and surveillance, and in that blurred line, Death had arrived. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a haunting echo of the night that had changed everything. Evan understood that the world would continue to judge, speculate, and remember, but his own reckoning would be quieter, lonelier, and eternal. The truth had been revealed, yes, but at the price of his mother's life and the innocence of the bond they once shared. He rose slowly and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet street. The town seemed unchanged, indifferent to the pain that had unfolded behind closed doors. Yet for him, nothing would ever be the same. He carried the weight of the truth, the consequences of his actions, and the understanding that some revelations cannot undo what has already been done. In the silence that followed, Evan whispered to the empty room, a confession to no one but himself. I wanted the truth, and it cost everything. He knew now that living with the aftermath was his punishment, and that some lessons, painful, irrevocable, and haunting, must be carried alone.